Well, the new book is entitled Surviving at the Top. There are many people who would say failing at the top.
Well, I think what the press has done is taken a situation where they see something and blown it to kingdom come. I've never seen anything like it. Whether it's a marriage, by the way, or whether it's financial, I've never seen press reporting as I have with regard to me. And I hope the general public understands how inherently dishonest the press in this country is.
Chapter 6, Grand Hotel, the Plaza Purchase. Ever since I got out of college, I've had a list of 10 New York properties that I want to acquire. I'm not ready to reveal what they are, but I will say that the Plaza Hotel has always been number one on that list. Actually, the Plaza has intrigued me since I was a kid. Maybe it was because I thought it resembled a French castle, or because horse-drawn hansom cabs were parked across the street near Central Park. Anyway, I've always been captivated by that magnificent building at 59th and 5th. I didn't have any personal involvement with the hotel, though, until I began buying stocks in the Allegius Corporation in early 1987. Allegius, once known as United Airlines, owned the Westin hotel chain, which at the time included the Plaza. I enjoyed being connected, even in that indirect way, with the great hotel. But that's really not why I bought the stock. I liked Allegius because I thought it was performing far below its potential. As an investor, I'll always look twice at a company that has great assets but lousy management. Take, for example, the decision to drop the name United Airlines in favor of Allegius. I considered that a truly dumb move, and I wasn't shy about calling Richard Ferris, who was then the company's CEO, and telling him how I felt. Why would he even consider doing such a thing? I once asked him. You have one of the best corporate names there are. Every time someone mentions United Airlines, you're getting publicity for your core business. Why would you spend $35 or $40 million to change all your logos all over the world to a name that means nothing to nobody? Ferris defended the decision by saying something about showcasing the new corporate synergy. I listened a while, then said, look, in my opinion, the word Allegius should be reversed for the next great disease. A few days later, I repeated that remark publicly. Not only did reporters use it in articles, but it wound up appearing in many newspapers as the quote of the week. When Ferris was finally forced out, not long afterward, a lot of people said that the disease crack brought about his fall. That could be. All I know is that the quote came at the right time, and it focused attention on the fact that something was seriously wrong. The Plaza served as further proof of Allegius's careless management. If anyone needed it, ever since it was built in 1907, the hotel has been a monument to success and glamour. The Vanderbilts, Wanamakers, and Whitneys had stayed in its luxurious suites and sipped champagne with visiting royalty in the grand ballroom. But about 30 years as a corporation-owned hotel, the Plaza looked tired and shabby. Anyone could see the effect of years of neglect in the lobby, where the carpets were getting worn. And in the palm court, where the flowers always looked a little faded, previous owners had even closed down what had been the Rose Room and later the Persian Room, and at leased it to a nondescript dress store at a ridiculously low rate. I would have loved to get my hands on the Plaza and use my management skills to return the hotel to its former stature. I happen to have a good track record with New York City hotels. The transformation of the old Commodore into the magnificent Grand Hyatt was a key deal early in my career, and since then, I'd revitalized the St. Mortes on Central Park South and 6th Avenue. Still, I didn't want to waste time daydreaming about the possibility of owning the Plaza. For one thing, its corporate ownership made that unfeasible. For another, my investment in Allegius was then going through the roof as others began realizing the asset value of the company. That development left me with two options. I could hold on to my shares and retain my remote connection with the Plaza, or I could sell the stock and make a huge profit after just a few months. It was not exactly a tough decision. I sold the stock. What happened next surprised me. Just as I was turning my attention from Allegius, the company announced that as part of a huge restructuring plan, it was selling off all of its non-airline assets, including, of course, the Plaza. That definitely piqued my interest, but only to a point. The Plaza, I realized, would be coming on the market as part of the 61 Hotel Westin chain. To get the one property I wanted, I'd have to buy the whole package and then spend at least a year or two selling off the 60 hotels that I couldn't care less about. To make matters even less appealing, as far as I was concerned, Allegius had to decide to conduct an auction for the Westin chain. Had decided to conduct an auction for the Westin chain. As a guy who prefers to negotiate one-on-one, I'll usually drop out of a deal rather than participate in an auction. This time, though, when a representative from First Boston, the company Westin had hired to run the sale, contacted me, I agreed to participate. I figured that the auction process would bring a piece considerably higher than I wanted to pay. Still, it didn't cost me anything to make a bid, and by being part of the process, I'd no doubt get to know more about the Plaza and the people who were in the market to buy it. The rules First Boston planned to go by were especially elaborate. Instead of having one auction, there would be a weeding out process whereby selected potential buyers would make a preliminary bid that would, if high enough, qualify them for the final auction some 6 weeks later. My preliminary bid was 1.3 billion. That, it turned out, placed me in the middle of a pack of potential buyers that included Martin Davis, the Kuwaiti government, and the team of Bob Bass and John Akai. It was the highest bid I'd ever made in my career, but it meant nothing. The serious moves in the deal, I knew, had yet to be made, and when they started, anything could happen. The buying and selling process of world-class hotels is an emotional business. When a place like the Plaza is on the block, the toughest negotiators become soft, and logic often gets tossed out the window. Study the recent markets, and you'll see the Sultan of Brunei buying the Beverly Hills Hotel at an unrealistic figure, a Japanese group paying a huge price for the international chain, and numerous other examples of people getting carried away when it comes to hotel purchases. Actually, the value of many things comes down to emotion. Why else are people paying $400 an ounce for gold and hundreds of thousands of dollars for a diamond that has absolutely no practical value? But hotels can arouse passions faster than any other possessions. When major ones come on the market, potential buyers start fantasizing about bringing their friends there, owning the social center of the community, and making the ultimate personal statement. The result is often a price with no basis in reality. Just when everyone's emotions could be expected to kick in, I decided to drop out. After reviewing the detailed financial information that Allegius made available to the auction finalists, I concluded that as much as I loved the Plaza, the circumstances just weren't right. When the time came, I would put in an unrealistically low bid of $1 billion for the Westin chain, and leave it at that. In deal making, you have to be able to draw a line and say to yourself, this is as far as I'm going. The ability to do that is in the genes. Either you have it or you don't. I know a guy who's a Wharton graduate and has a truly brilliant business mind when he worked for other people, but a few months ago, he was buying a house for himself, and he was a total disaster. Don, what should I do? He said to me. Should I call the broker? The owner? My God, what's happening with this house? He hadn't slept for about a week. I told him, you're really lucky you work for someone else as opposed to being your own guy, because emotionally, you're not equipped to be your own boss. The true deal, people, sleep at night no matter what. In any case, no sooner had I decided to drop out of the auction than I got a phone call from a talented lawyer named Tom Barak, asking if he might stop by my office to chat about the Plaza situation. At that time, I didn't know much about Barak, except that he represented Bob Bass, a Texas oil magnate and investor who was starting to emerge from the shadow of his older brother, Sid. I'd done business with Bob a few years earlier, when he sold me his 21% interest in the Alexander's retail chain for $50 million, and I liked his style. His approach to the Weston auction was no exception. Bob, with Tom Barak's help, had hooked up with John Akoe, the head of the huge Tokyo-based construction firm, for the express purpose of acquiring Weston. Since Bob was interested mainly in the Plaza, and Akoe was excited by the prospect of owning a coast-to-coast American chain, it looked like an ideal partnership. In the upcoming auction, they seemed the team to beat. It was obvious that Tom agreed with my assessment when he came by for our get-to-know-you session, but as he sat across from the desk from me, exuding confidence and exchanging pleasantries, he also seemed to be subtly probing to see how I might feel about buying the Plaza if Bob Bass acquired it and then decided for some reason to sell. That could easily have been taken as a sign of fear or indecision on Bass's part, but I saw it as something else. A very shrewd, very conservative businessman making sure he had a back door out of his deal if he wanted it. My response was immediate and straightforward. "Tom, if you ever find yourself wanting to sell the Plaza," I said, "consider me interested." There was no reason to be cute or coy. I didn't want to pick up the paper one day and find out the Plaza had been sold to some chic or Far Eastern conglomerate. At the same time, there was no reason for him to know that the hotel was in fact number one on my secret wish list. A few days later, after Tom Barak and I had our meeting, in mid-October of 1987, the stock market crashed, dropping 500 points in a single afternoon. One thing this did was make a shambles of the upcoming Weston auction, hoping that First Boston might be feeling a little picky and jump at any halfway decent offer. Many of the would-be buyers started making preemptive bids. One group, headed by former Weston CEO Harry Mulkin, offered just over $1 billion, and Martin Davis weighed in at $1.15 billion. When the dust settled, though, it was Bass and Akoe who had walked away with the Weston chain for a reported $1.53 billion. I was glad to see that happen. From the start, Bob Bass, the chairman of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, loved the Plaza, as only a connoisseur of fine buildings could. Soon after the deal closed, he and his wife Anne came in from Fort Worth and spent some time at the hotel, walking through the corridors and having dinner in the Oak Room. Bob's brother Sid would later get married at the Plaza. By then, I'd all but put the Plaza out of my mind. I was too busy with other deals to feel bad. And then Barak called again. On the phone, his tone was as charming and non-committal as ever, but his suggestion that we get together for a breakfast meeting made me think that Bob and John Akoe must be contemplating a move of some kind. I'd always thought that they might consider selling off the crown jewel of the Weston chain, the Plaza, because, if handled properly, that could in effect reduce by about $400 million the rather full price they'd paid for the chain, and make the Weston acquisition more reasonable. Over breakfast, however, Barak insisted that Bob was too enthralled with the Plaza to sell. Although I liked Tom Barak a lot, I wanted to say, "Well then, what the hell are we doing here eating croissants?" What I did instead was pepper him with questions that I wanted him to take back to his group. Had Bob really thought about life with the New York tough hotel unions? What about the Plaza's outdated computer and phone systems? Had he considered the need to replace the freight elevators still working on the 1907 water hydraulic machinery? Did he really think that he could manage a property like this from Texas? I was empathetic but friendly. If Barak wanted to arrange a sale, he knew where to come. If not, life would go on. After that, several weeks went by, in which I was busy doing a lot of things, including last-minute work on a boxing match between Mike Tyson and the former heavyweight champ Larry Holmes. I sensed it shaping up as a huge success. A night in which Atlantic City Convention Center would be packed with celebrities such as Madonna, Don Johnson, Norman Mailer, and John McConaughey. So I invited Barak to fly down with me in my helicopter. I wanted to keep in touch with Tom, who I liked personally, but more than that, I wanted him to understand that I would definitely not be overwhelmed by the prospect of owning the world's greatest hotel. It was an important point to communicate. When you're in the position to sell a truly precious piece of real estate, you don't deal with just anyone who has the money. You look for the kind of people who would cherish the property and bring something to it by their own very presence. On the night of the fight, I introduced Barack to a lot of people, half kiddingly, as a guy I'm going to be doing a lot of very big deals with. It was part positive thinking on my part because the line was a little presumptuous, and Barack knew it. Part private joke. I kept up that friendly, bantering tone whenever we spoke on the phone during the next couple of months. It wasn't anything terribly calculated, but it worked to relieve the tension between two parties who were probably thinking about each other a lot, but saying very little in each other's presence. In a deal, you never want to be tough or unfriendly for no reason. You can often get a lot more accomplished. And besides, life is just plain more pleasant when you deal as friends instead of enemies. In January 1988, Tom Barack called and suggested we have another meeting. When he mentioned that David Bonderman, Bob Bass's chief of staff, happened to be in New York and would like to sit down on the discussion, I agreed. Maybe, I thought, after all these months, they were finally ready to make a move. The meeting, though, turned out to be a total dud. I sensed Bonderman was a testy guy the minute I saw him, but I explained that I understood very well the difficulty of running a hotel from a great distance, as well as their desire to get a fair price. I also made a pitch for myself as a guy who was in a financial position not only to close the deal immediately, but also to carry off the major renovation the building deserved. They listened, then said that Bob Bass didn't see being based in Texas as an insurmountable problem, and in any case, the Plaza wasn't ready for sale. It was the same frustrating stuff I'd been hearing for months. Bonderman was especially discouraging, and after the discussion had broken up, I asked John Bernstein, an attorney of mine who'd sat in with me that day, "How did you make of all that?" John shook his head and said, "It went from looking good to not looking awfully good fast." It went from looking good to not looking good awfully fast. I had to agree. But then, that wasn't surprising. Almost every deal is a bit of a roller coaster ride. You've got to realize that at the outset and just relax. About 2 weeks after that get-together, Barack called, quite out of the blue, and said that he'd like to have another meeting to discuss the possible sale of the Plaza. This time I was surprised, but I put off feeling happy about the sudden development until I heard their price. When he arrived in my office, Barack was as polite as ever, but very businesslike. Bob Bass would accept no less than $450 million in cash for the hotel, he said. Then he added that if I was interested, I'd have to agree to waive the standard contingency clause that would represent a huge concession on my part, because if I waived that clause and anything in the financial data or in the building itself proved faulty or not as promised, I couldn't sue. On the whole, though, it was an interesting proposal. Barack's price wasn't as outrageous as it might have been. The Plaza, if you considered its stature, its history, and its attractiveness to the kind of buyer to whom money is no object, was worth that much, or more. On the other hand, if you looked at the situation strictly in economic terms, comparing the cash flow the hotel generated with the annual financial charges that would be due, $450 million, was a high price. I wasn't going to be a fool for love, I told Barack. The way I saw things, $350 million was the right price. He didn't register any particular emotion, but since we didn't even seem to be within haggling distance, there was nothing to do but shake hands and part company. By the time he got on the elevator, I was knee-deep in other important business. I'm not by any means a workaholic, as I've said, but having a lot on your plate is one of those golden secrets of deal-making. I'll never forget a friend who once spent 2 years concentrating on a single big project. There's no way you can make a good deal, I told him. When the heavy negotiating starts, you'll be thinking about what you have at stake and how it all might go to waste. And on the other side, we'll see the fear in your eyes and take advantage of you. To make sure I don't ever find myself in that position, I try to have a minimum of 10 deals working at all times. That way I can concentrate on the ones that are going well and walk away from the rest. Which is exactly what I did after that meeting with Barack. It wasn't easy knowing that perhaps the one chance I'd ever get to own the Plaza might be slipping through my fingers, but I put the hotel out of my mind and resisted the temptation to go anywhere near it. If I had not been seen walking around the Plaza at this point, I would not only have given Barack a chance to see how interested I was, I would also have to draw out the sharks who come out of nowhere and drive up the price of anything I'm after, on the theory that if Trump wants it, it must be worth having. So although it's my style to research it properly, thoroughly, I stayed far away. People in my organization, people who remembered that when I was buying an apartment house in Brooklyn or Queens, I would check every screw and bolt, would say to me, "How's the piping? What about the air conditioning?" And I would have to say, "Look, we'll check out all that after we close. This is a Plaza Hotel I'm buying, and the Plaza Hotel is much more than the sum of its parts." Tom Barack and I didn't talk for the next 3 weeks. Then on Saturday, February 27th, I called Tom and asked if he could come by my office the following Tuesday morning. I sensed in my gut that it was time to get the deal done, for several reasons. I knew Bob Bass didn't need to sell the Plaza for financial purposes, yet it was clear that he was actively looking for a buyer. Barack, I knew, had been talking to a number of investors from all over the world, including Australia and Hong Kong. I'm sure they were all very fine people, but the Plaza, after years of neglect, deserved something better than absentee ownership and ordinary management. Here I was. Meanwhile, a guy with a vision of what the hotel could be, and the money to make that vision a reality. In all honesty, I could have delayed more and negotiated harder for the Plaza. Normally I believe in fighting all out for every point, but this was a unique situation. In my mind, it was simply right and proper for me to have the Plaza. For Bob Bass to sell to anyone else, I felt, would have just been plain silly. My Tuesday morning meeting with Barack lasted about 10 minutes. Essentially, we met halfway between our original offers, at $400 million, and had an agreement to protect the deal while my lawyer John Bernstein and Barack worked out the deals. 2 weeks later, we reconvened to hash things out more definitely. After thinking about it, Barack said Bob Bass thought the price should be $10 million more than what we'd agreed on. I agreed to go to $407.5 million, but asked that the deal now include 22 Central Park South, an apartment building next door to the Plaza. I also asked for the reinstatement of the contingency clause so that I'd have legal recourse in the event of any major problems. Barack agreed to those points. The sale of the Plaza was a huge news event. No one had ever paid more for a single hotel, and the immediate reaction from the Monday morning quarterbacks was that I'd greatly overpaid. Some people even compared me with Merv Griffin, saying that I'd gotten carried away, much as he had in the resort's deal, that I wasn't my usual self. To that, I can only say that I wound up with the Plaza. I was so happy to have it that I delighted with the deal that I made. Tom and Bob Bass were totally honorable. I know that while the contracts were being prepared, they got several offers for substantially more money than I was paying, and from some very powerful groups, and they refused even to accept these people's phone calls. Their integrity reminded me a lot of the time when I was setting out to build Trump Tower and was negotiating with Walter Halving, the president of Tiffany, for the crucial air rights over his building. When his subordinates came to him and said, "We can get more money than Trump is paying," Walter was incredulous. "You don't understand," he said. I gave my word. I shook his hand. Bob Bass, John Accoy, and Tom Barack were exactly the same way. In a world full of deceit and dishonor, it's nice to know such people exist. I trusted Tom and the others so implicitly that I began spending time and money on the Plaza even before the deal officially closed. That's something I wouldn't normally do, if only because hotel closings can't be complicated all-night affairs in which teams of lawyers and accountants from both sides argue over exactly what's included in the purchase price. I'll never forget the situation with Leanna Helmsley in 1985 when I bought the St. Mortiz from her husband, Harry, and Lawrence Wayne. Leona kept everyone involved in the closing up until dawn, manically counting every towel and teacup in the hotel. I didn't see what was happening with Bob Bass and John Accoy. I took my first behind-the-scenes tour of the Plaza as an owner early in the summer of 1988 with Richard Wilhelm, our vice president and general manager. Although only in his mid-40s, Dick Gardy had a great deal of hotel management experience, having worked at, among other places, the Waldorf Astoria, the St. Regis, and Trump Castle. He understands that a great hotel is a living, breathing place that can be killed by complacency. When Ivana and I brought him from Atlantic City, where he'd set up an employee training program that allowed workers to earn credits towards a degree in hotel administration from Michigan State, Dick was eager to roll up his sleeves and begin making changes. Fortunately, he shared our belief that at the Plaza, we should forget about glitz and work towards restoring the hotel to its former grandeur. Before we started our tour, Dick said that day with a twinkle in his eye, "I'm happy to inform you that we're going to be thoroughly appalled by some of what we're going to see." I know what he meant, that there were great opportunities for improvement along the way. "Good," I said. "Let's start at the top." The first thing I saw when I stepped out onto the Plaza roof was a magnificent sweeping view of one of the great crossroads of the world. The second thing I noticed was an old green paint shed that had been put up some 30 years before. Since 1947, when the original owners sold the hotel, the Plaza had been run by a succession of chain operators, Hilton, Sonesta, and Westin. All around the hotel there were signs of the mediocre management. It's almost inevitable when large public corporations are involved, but this ugly rooftop structure was one of the most appalling. Standing there, I immediately started to visualize what could be one of the most spectacular residences in the world. "What an incredible waste," I said to Dick. "We could rip this down and make it over into the top floor of a beautiful duplex apartment that we could probably lease for $1 million a year." From there we walked down one flight to the 19th floor, which was taken up by 30,000 square feet of offices leased to the architectural firm of Lee Harris Pomeroy. Here again, the views of Central Park were spectacular, but the previous owners, panicking in the face of the bad times that had hit New York City in the late 70s, had seen fit to lease the entire floor for $10 a square foot, about the price of downtown warehouse space. As I stood before a large photo of a Fifth Avenue building that was hanging in the hallway, I got an idea and knocked on the door of the boss, Lee Pomeroy. "Was this building your project?" I asked, pointing to the picture. He said it was, and he told me about some other things his firm was involved in. "I like your work," I said, "and I got a proposition for you. What I wanted," I told him straight out, "was to get back his space so that I could create luxury duplexes along the top floor of the Plaza." "I know you've got a good deal here," I said, "so how about this? If you agree to vacate by next March, you can be, along with Hardy, Holzman, Pfeiffer, the architect on the Plaza renovation, which could be the most exciting project you've ever done." His eyes lit up, and we shook hands on a deal right there. Then I headed down to the next floor. Things were rolling, and I was feeling great. Later, when I went into the archives and looked over the 1907 plans of architect Harry Hardenberg, I discovered that his ideas had been strikingly similar to the ones I had in mind, and that made me feel even better. Weston had actually spent $89 million renovating the Plaza, but as I toured the building that day, I was stunned by how little of it showed. The marble staircases between floors were dull from wear and grime. Many of the bedspreads in the Plaza's 800 rooms were stained beyond any hope of cleaning, and the bellmen's uniforms were frayed at the cuffs and were missing buttons. One thing I found especially offensive as I walked the hotel's spacious corridors was that virtually all the beautiful, detailed moldings which originally had been enhanced by real gold leaf, had simply been painted over with yellow or, in some cases, ugly brown paint. If that had been part of an organized campaign to cut costs, I might have been able to understand it. But for every dollar saved, thousands were being wasted. Everywhere I went in the hotel, I saw a precious commodity floor area being squandered. The entire 8th floor was serving as a storage place, simply because I guess that's what had always been done. The biggest suite in that building, a duplex encompassing 20 rooms and a walk-in wine vault, was being used by the hotel's managing director as his private apartment. And at a time when the Plaza's catering staff was so busy it was turning people away, a great deal of space on the banquet room level was taken by offices for the Plaza's personal staff. Something had to be done, and by the time the day was finished, I'd formulated a basic plan to clear 80 years' worth of garbage out of the basement, put in a bright, new, modern office for the personnel people, and build new dining rooms that would allow us to increase revenues by several $1 million a year. Ivana became president of the Plaza in June of 1988, moving over from Trump Castle. Barbara Rise, the no-nonsense woman who had been supervised the construction of Trump Tower, understood what I was after as well as anyone, and that's why I put her in charge of the hotel's renovation. I loved to pore over material in the archives. As I analyzed the old menus, souvenir books, and photographs, I felt as if I were trying to solve a mystery, which in a way I was, the mystery of exactly what the Plaza looked like in its glory days. And little by little, the clues were adding up. One day, while checking out something in the obscure corner of the Plaza's sub-basement, I saw a beautiful brass clock, and then another, and another, just gathering dust far back on some shelves. As it turned out, the Plaza used to have one of those clocks on the marble mantels of each of its 260 fireplaces. All the smaller clocks were connected to one central clock, which meant that all the timepieces in the hotel were precisely synchronized. It was a great old system. A few years before, though, some genius who was probably trying to impress the guy ahead of him in the corporate pecking order must have gotten the idea that the clocks were cheaper to store than to maintain, so he recollected them to the basement. Ivana and I agreed that all 260 clocks should be cleaned, refitted with quartz works, and put back on the mantels as soon as possible. Paging carefully one day through a marvelous 1907 copy of a magazine called Architectural Record, I saw an ad for a Brooklyn tile company that boasted it had installed the floor in the Plaza's Oak Room. At the present time, I knew there was an old, worn-out wall-to-wall carpet in the Oak Room. Ivana ordered one corner lifted to see what was underneath, and sure enough, there was the beautiful old mosaic floor that had been mentioned in the ad. The only problem was that it was marred in places by dirt and carpet glue. I went back to that old magazine, got the company's name, and looked it up. Not only was it still in business, but the grandson of the man who'd originally laid the floor answered the phone. At our request, he came over to clean and restore the tile so that the Oak Room Patreons might once again see the fine mosaic work in all of its glory. Another idea we got from the archives was the restoration of the champagne porch, which sits just above the front desk. Once a romantic little spot for sipping a drink while watching the traffic in the lobby below, the area was until recently boarded up with plywood, painted to look like marble. Back in the 40s, when air conditioning came in, the jewel-like little space had been shut down because somebody decided it wasn't worth the extra cooling cost. I looked at it another way. The most practical thing I could do was enhance the Plaza as a work of art. The champagne porch, looking every bit as elegant as it did in the days of F. Scott Fitzgerald and John Bet-A-Million Gates, will make the triumphant return in 1992. A lot of other ideas about how to restore the hotel came from employees who'd been there since the good old days. I remember walking through the ballroom one day when about 20 designers, consultants, architects, and others, all of whom were telling me that I should take down the curtains, move the doorways, and change everything around in ways that I, frankly, found mind-boggling. On an impulse, I grabbed one of the waiters and asked him how long he'd worked at the Plaza. 37 years, he said. I then ushered him off to a quiet spot and began asking him questions. Oh, Mr. Trump, We need the curtains because we have shows, he said. But you want to know what has been changed. But if you want to know what has been changed, I'll tell you. In about 5 minutes, he and I formulated a basic master plan for the renovation of the ballroom. The key to improving the plaza is that I move fast and decisively, unencumbered by any bureaucracy. I may not always make the right move, for instance. My announcement that Ivana would be paid $1 a year and all the dresses she could buy me got me in some trouble. But there was never any bureaucratic bullshit. I walk through the place, see things I don't like, and immediately work on getting them changed. When Ivana would call and say that she wanted to spend $150,000 to redo each of the suites, she could get an answer, yes or no, in 30 seconds. It doesn't have to be a problem involving money either. Not long after she took over the plaza, Ivana called me to say that she had asked the hotel maintenance people to imprint the sand in the lobby ashtrays with the plaza logo, but the union leaders were giving her a hard time. I called the union and worked it out. If I'd been some corporate executive, we'd probably just now be having our third or fourth meeting on the issue. Of course, I don't want to do everything at breakneck speed. I allowed my exterior architects, Hardy Holzman Pfeiffer Associates, as well as Lee Pomeroy's people, all the time they needed to develop a magnificent plan for bringing the plaza back to its original state. The job before them wasn't easy. What I wanted entailed a great number of changes to the building, including adding 14 new suites to the top and cutting windows through the magnificent green mansard roof. Meanwhile, whatever they did would have to please not just me, but the city's Landmarks Preservation Commission as well as the critics and the people of New York. I'm happy to say that they came through like champions with the most sensitive and historically accurate renovation I'd ever seen. In addition to removing the storage structure on the roof, their plan called for the creation of a stunning interior light well over the Palm Court, the restoration of the Fifth Avenue entrance lobby, the rebirth of the Rose Room, the addition of the turn-of-the-century decorative awnings, the numerous other improvements inside and out. Not only did the Landmarks Commission approve the proposal, but Paul Goldberger, the New York Times critic, reviewed the renovation plan and gave it unqualified raves. There is no building New Yorkers feel as possessive about as the Plaza, Goldberg started out. He then went on to praise the plan virtually point by point and acknowledged that the hotel wasn't a museum piece, but a consistently evolving environment. In September 1988, I took a full-page ad in the New York Times. Under the headline, "Why I Bought the Plaza," I wrote, "I haven't purchased a building, I have purchased a masterpiece, the Mona Lisa. For the first time in my life, I have knowingly made a deal which was not economic, for I can never justify the price I paid, no matter how successful the plaza becomes. What I have done, however, is to give to New York City the opportunity to have a hotel which transcends all others. The plaza will transcend all others. I am committed to making the plaza New York's single greatest hotel, perhaps the greatest hotel in the world." As soon as I purchased the plaza, I realized that the St. Mortiz didn't fit into my current plans. I'd had a great run with the place, buying it for $71 million in 1985 and managing it to a gross operating profit averaging $11.5 million every year since. But I didn't need to compete with myself by owning another large hotel, also in need of renovation, just one block west of the plaza on Central Park South. I wanted a neat, clean, quick deal for the St. Mortiz so that I could keep my attention focused on the plaza. But because the St. Mortiz was so successful and had such a prime location, I didn't see why I should make a financial sacrifice just to make a sale. My solution to this dilemma was to call Alan Bond, a wealthy Australian investor. I first met Alan a few years ago when he was supporting an Australian syndicate in the America's Cup yacht races, and I was backing an American sailing team that was determined to get the prize back. He impressed me then as one of the world's greatest characters, a guy who shot from the hip and took his chances as they came. A few years later, I watched in amazement as he got caught up in a major art auction and wound up paying a record $53.9 million for Van Gogh's irises. Alan, I realized at that point, doesn't mess around. When I phoned him, he was openly interested in the St. Mortiz from the start, and when he came to see me in my office later, he was only there for about 20 minutes before we signed a letter of agreement saying that he'd bought the hotel for $180 million, giving me a profit of $110 million, not including its operating profit. The only negotiating we did came when Alan offered me irises as partial payment. I told him I just couldn't accept the painting. What would I do with it? I asked him. To be frank, I don't see how he can run the St. Mortizes profitably at the price that he paid. In the interim, Alan has encountered financial problems, but he was happy when he left, and naturally, so was I. I predict that Alan will make a great comeback. A lot of profit I made on the St. Mortiz has been poured back into the Plaza. I won't be satisfied until all the gold leaf glitters, every inch of marble sparkles, and each bronze handrail shines. Even if I wanted to be cavalier about the hotel, the public wouldn't let me. I'm still amazed by the uproar I caused when I announced that I would be closing Trader Vic's. To me, it was a little more than a bar and restaurant off the lobby specializing in fake Polynesian cuisine and exotic drinks loaded with tiny plastic swords and paper umbrellas. I envisioned turning the space into a health club, or perhaps a 90s version of Le Club, the exclusive hot, where I spent my many evenings just after I moved to Manhattan. When I said Trader Vic's had gotten tacky, however, a lot of people objected to my criticizing a part of my own hotel. How dare I denigrate the place where they'd gone after their senior prom, they said. In response to my announcement, so many people poured in for a sentimental drink and one last Paw platter that I decided to keep the place open for the time being. Ultimately, though, the Plaza will be remembered as the finest hotel not only in New York City, but the world. That's already happening. Not long ago, the Condé Nast Traveler ran a major story in which they asked 25 of the world's leading hoteliers where they would choose to stay while traveling. The Plaza was the only New York hotel on the list compiled by those discriminating people. People, as the magazine said, sensitive to the smallest imperfection. I'd like to share with you what James Daly, the owner of the Copley Plaza Hotel in Boston, said about the Plaza in that article. We had champagne waiting on our arrival, bathrobes, hair dryers, and Chanel perfume were in the room. The entire first floor was being finished, and the function rooms and the ballroom were lovely, done in red. Room service was fast, and the staff was pleasant. We needed tickets to a play at the last minute, and the concierge got them for us. It was all done in a grand style. Donald stopped by at our table while we were having dinner in the Oak Room. The food was excellent. Ivana, Dick Willem, and the entire staff have done a fantastic job. The hotel has truly been a turnaround. The final word on the Plaza has yet to be written, but I do know that I've taken a world-famous, one-of-a-kind institution and enhanced its value. As a businessman and a lover of fine buildings, I can live with that for now. The next chapter is called Chapter 7, Flying High, the Shuttle Story. At 5 o'clock on May 24th, 1989, a loud cheer went up in my suite of offices. Thanks to a court ruling in my favor, the Eastern Shuttle would at last become the Trump Shuttle and take to the skies. The news from the court ended one of the longest, toughest battles I'd ever waged. But while everyone else was celebrating our entrance into a new business, I had a feeling of deja vu. The Eastern Shuttle reminded me very much of the Plaza Hotel. Both were great American institutions that had been decorated badly in terms of their image and the service they provided, and now both were mine to preserve and improve as best I could while the world watched. The shuttle deal had begun a few years earlier with a phone call I received from Frank Lorenzo. Frank, who had taken over Eastern Airlines not long before, asked if he might drop by my office to discuss an idea he was working on. Since I'd always been intrigued by the airline business, and since there's never any harm in talking, I said sure, and we made an appointment for the next day. At that time, I didn't know Frank personally, but I was well aware of his reputation as the CEO of Texas Air Corporation. Frank was known as a tough, cold takeover artist, a guy who bought troubled airlines like Continental, People Express, and New York Air, and turned them into low-cost operations, usually by breaking the unions, slashing salaries, and lopping off unprofitable operations. He always had very little to say to the press, which meant that the union leaders, his avowed enemies, wound up shaping his public image. They depicted him, with their quotes and stories, as an evil, Darth Vader-type character, an executive who was, to say the least, no friend of the working man. When he came up to my office, Frank didn't strike me as an ogre. I did notice, however, that he dispensed with all small talk and got quickly to the point, a plan to create a subsidiary of Texas Air that would buy the Shuttle from Eastern. Would I be interested, he asked, in becoming an investor, along with him and a few others, in this proposed Shuttle spinoff? In some respects, it was an intriguing idea. Eastern New York's Washington and New York Boston had been profitable practically from the day they were introduced in the early 1960s. The Shuttle, more than just a means of transportation, was now a way of life for the influential people who traveled across the so-called Power Corridor in the Northeast. On top of that, Eastern had the best locations at the airports in each of the 3 shuttle cities, as well as a tradition of flights every hour on the hour, a seemingly simple bit of scheduling that in fact gave the airline a huge advantage over the competition. Normally, no executive in his right mind would sell off such a crown jewel, and Frank was very much in control of his facilities, of his faculties. So what was this all about? Actually, the situation was easy to understand. Eastern was a company in dire financial straits. To keep the once proud airline going, Frank desperately needed the cash that the sale of the Shuttle would bring. As I sat listening to Frank, I couldn't help but be impressed by some of his qualities. He had the lean, almost gaunt look of a guy who had tremendous mental and physical endurance. The result, I learned later, of his long-distance jogging. Judging by the plan he outlined, I believed he was also a first-class deal-maker. But while his idea was interesting, it just wasn't for me. What Frank was looking for was basically a backer for an operation that he would run. I don't like putting up large amounts of money and then having someone else decide how a project will be handled. There's no kick in it for me unless I can go out, find the best people, and then manage the company, I told Frank. But, I added, if the Eastern Shuttle ever comes on the market, I'd love to buy it. Although I meant what I said, I didn't really think I'd get a chance at the Shuttle, a world-class asset again. Many months later, however, a time when thoughts of Eastern were far from my mind, I got a call from Frank asking if I was still interested. By then, he had dropped his plan to buy the operation himself through a subsidiary. Now he was talking about a deal that offered exactly what I wanted, a chance to acquire and operate that small gem of an airline on my own. Yes, I said, I'm definitely interested. We arranged to meet for breakfast the next morning. Without letting myself get too excited, I felt I had a strong shot at getting the Shuttle. Frank, I knew, had something to do about Eastern Airlines, and quickly the company had been in bad shape when he took over from Frank Borman, the former astronaut, in 1986. Now, not only was Eastern continuing to hemorrhage money, but it seems on the verge of a civil war. A huge number of pilots had quit in the course of the last year. Other workers were passing around pictures of Frank with a target drawn over his face, and there were even reports of physical violence. At one point, Alfred Kahn, the former chairman of the Civil Aeronautics Board, said that Frank and Charles Bryan, the head of the Machinists' Union, were like 2 scorpions in a bottle. The hatred is so great, he noted, that they seemed prepared to ruin the airline. Through it all, Frank just kept quiet and took the heat. In life, most people are big talk and no action. Frank is that rare person who is all action and no talk. I'm not saying that's a good thing, because some talk perhaps could have eased the tension with the unions and prevented the continuing decline of Eastern, but no amount of pressure could make Frank reveal what he might do if the machinist struck, how he felt about the possibility of taking Eastern into bankruptcy, or any of the other issues then threatening the airline's very existence. The funny thing is, I found Frank man-to-man to be a very different guy from the reclusive, evil maniac you read about in the business press. I met with him numerous times over the next couple of months, always in the Edwardian room of the Plaza Hotel, and found him relaxed, charming, and compassionate, despite his feelings about the union leaders. Frank is also a devoted family man who cares very deeply about his wife Sharon and their children. As a deal maker, though, Frank turned out to be, as expected, quite tough. In the Shuttle, he had an extremely valuable asset under his control, and from the start of the negotiations, it was clear he knew it. Frank's asking price for the Shuttle and 17 Boeing's 727s was $425 million. I thought I could get it for less, and made a counteroffer of $325 million. I kept stressing to Frank that by selling to me, not only would he get a buyer who could secure financing with no problem, but, perhaps just as important, he would keep a potentially profitable operation away from his competitors. In all fairness, you might get more from American or United, I said to Frank. But why make the competition stronger? Ultimately, he agreed, and we settled on a price of $365 million and signed the contracts. We were both pleased with the deal we'd made, but at the press conference, we called to announce the sale. I saw that Frank was either unable or unwilling to communicate his good feelings to the public. As soon as the reporters began asking questions, Frank got tense and combative, and he came off looking like the villain everyone assumed he was. Frank flew off the handle at the very first question. In fact, and something that I'd never seen before, the reporter actually wanted to leave the room. He was so offended by Frank's attitude. Unfortunately, my initial delight in the Shuttle deal didn't last long. A few days later, after we'd signed our agreement, Eastern's 3 unions filed a lawsuit attempting to block the sale. The pilots, machinists, and flight attendants believed, rightly or wrongly, that the sale of Eastern's crown jewel could make it impossible for the company to remain a force in the airline business. They felt this was the first step in dismantling of Eastern Airlines, a process that could lead to the loss of their jobs, or at the very least, deep pay cuts. Whether or not that was actually Frank's intention, no one knew. The unions, however, were willing to believe anything bad about Frank, and eager to do anything that might screw up his plans. Eastern's attorneys were very worried about winning the case, but not because they had doubts about our legal position. What concerned them was that our case was being heard in federal court by Barrington Parker, a judge who had previously ruled against Eastern in a case the company thought it would win. Eastern's people believed, perhaps with some justification, that Judge Parker felt a strong animosity towards them and their controversial leader. When we met to discuss our strategy in the case, I told Eastern's lawyers that I wanted to testify. Their immediate reaction was to veto the idea. It was too risky, they said, too bold. Such things just weren't done, and so on. They had a million reasons why I should stay on the sidelines. I, on the other hand, thought it would help our case, because the image of Donald Trump in the minds of many is that of a flamethrower, a tyrant, a businessman who goes around destroying his competition. If I could take the stand, I felt I could show that image, at least in many respects, is false. If the judge sees I'm a decent guy and not the wild man portrayed in the media, I told the Eastern people, it can only help our case. And besides, I added, you feel you're fighting a total uphill battle anyway, so what do you have to lose? Finally, one really sharp lawyer from the Eastern team, David Boyes of Craveth, Swan, and Moore, had the guts to say he agreed with me. It was Boyes' recommendation that persuaded Eastern to allow me to testify. And in the end, my testimony before Judge Parker went very well. While I was on the stand, I was able to make the points that Eastern Airlines was in tremendous trouble and that the employees were in a very precarious position. I also noted that if the shuttle deal was not made and Eastern did not receive my $365 million, everyone at the airline could soon be out of work. Finally, I pointed out that the asset was eroding and soon would be worth far less than the price I was willing to pay. As we spoke, I could sense that all these arguments had a great impact on the judge, who I found to be a wonderful guy. We won the lawsuit, and with legal distractions behind me, or so I thought, I plunged back into the process of getting the Trump shuttle off the ground. By this time, I had hired a team, including executives who had helped start the Pan Am shuttle. They, in turn, had put together a staff that was working on getting all the necessary FAA approvals and licenses, as well as hiring pilots and other employees, putting together a marketing plan, and bringing in designers to refurbish the 727s I was getting from Eastern. It was a huge undertaking, but everyone's adrenaline was flowing, and morale in my newly created shuttle division couldn't have been higher. Then one day, in the midst of all our preparations, we got word that the unions had appealed Judge Parker's decision. In a way, this wasn't surprising. All the unions cared about at that point was destroying Frank Lorenzo. It was almost as if he were the devil and had to be defeated at all costs. If you got past the emotions, however, what the unions were doing was tremendously self-destructive. After all, here I was, a new player who wanted to forge an alliance with labor as they launched the Trump shuttle. Now, by pursuing an appeal, the very people who would benefit from my getting the shuttle were delaying and possibly ruining my deal. The appeal process would take a long time, and while their case was pending, I couldn't close. If I gave a check for $365 million to Eastern, which was headed for bankruptcy, and the unions won, I could be forced to give back the shuttle, even though Eastern might not have the money to refund me. Although I was eager to get the shuttle going and was confident of victory, I couldn't risk $365 million under those circumstances. Another thing that worried me was that while the appeal process dragged on, I'd have to continue working very hard to get all my approvals in order and hire hundreds of employees in anticipation of taking over the shuttle quickly. In other words, great amounts of time, energy, and money were being spent in preparation for an asset that in the end might never arrive. Threatening my position even further was Eastern's possible bankruptcy. That could take the shuttle out of my control and put its fate into the hands of a judge whose concern would be to see if anyone wanted to top my bid and take the asset away. On March 4th, 1989, the machinist struck the airline, and, to my surprise, I think, of Frank Lorenzo, the pilots and flight attendants honored the picket lines. What that meant, in a nutshell, was that Eastern could fly only a tiny percentage of its routes. If the plane couldn't fly, there'd be no reverse. And if there was no revenue, bankruptcy couldn't be far off. With the situation worsening daily, I called Frank Lorenzo and spoke bluntly of my concerns. "Look, I know where Eastern is going," I said, "and I'm aware that you might have to file for bankruptcy. That's your business, but I deserve some protection." More than anything, I wanted to avoid being used as a stalking horse who would endorse the shuttle as a good deal, but in the end, not get it because the bankruptcy court and its board of creditors awarded it to a higher bidder. It seems that when I want to buy something, a lot of people come out of the woodwork waving money. That's what happened with Merv Griffin and the Resorts International deal. These people operate on the theory that if I bid on something, it must be worth considerably more than what I'm offering. To protect myself in case the shuttle wound up in bankruptcy court, I asked Frank to amend our agreement. The clause I wanted said that a substantial fee would be paid to me by Eastern if, for any reason, the shuttle went to somebody else. We fought long and hard on this point, but in the end, Frank agreed that a fee of $8 million would go to me if the shuttle wound up with another buyer. That was one of my better moves, because it allowed me the security of knowing I could invest a large amount of money in the shuttle and still walk away with a slight profit if I didn't get what I was after. But what was even more significant than the money was the position that agreement put me in. Because I could continue working full speed ahead. I could close a deal for the shuttle 6 months before anyone else. Anyone, that is, except an already established airline. In the eyes of bankruptcy court, being able to move with that kind of speed would give me a great advantage. It's a good thing I was prepared for a worst-case scenario, because things at Eastern certainly weren't getting any better. The airline had managed to keep the shuttle flying after the strike, but market share was diminishing steadily. Passengers didn't want to cross picket lines, especially to fly in an airline whose regular mechanics weren't coming to work. Even an attempt to promote the shuttle by charging lower fares had no lasting effect on load levels. The asset was deteriorating before my eyes. I called Frank Lorenzo and asked, once again, to renegotiate our deal. He wasn't happy to hear from me, but with market share down from 56 to 17%, he probably wasn't surprised either. Frank, I said, the value of what I bought from you is disintegrating. Pan Am is picking up customers, not because they're good, but it's just because they're there. What I asked him to do ultimately What I asked him to do ultimately was to include an additional 5 727s in our $365 million deal as a compensation for the diminished value of the shuttle. We agreed bitterly over this point, but finally Frank agreed to give me the planes. That was a minor victory. It increased the value of my deal and allowed me to refurbish my fleet without taking any needed planes out of service. I was actually starting to feel optimistic again about the shuttle at this point because I'd made something good out of a very bad situation. But if the story of this deal proves anything, it is the value of perseverance in the face of adversity. On March 9th, the other shoe finally dropped when Eastern filed for bankruptcy. When that happened, control of the company passed from Frank Lorenzo to the bankruptcy court and board of creditors, and one by one, people who wanted to take over the airline began emerging. One of the first was Peter Uberroth, who had just resigned as baseball commissioner. Peter is a wonderful guy, and a talented guy whose idea was to put together a coalition of investors and unions. I never understood how he expected the company to be profitable the way he was restructuring it. Nor am I sure this day if it included the purchase of the shuttle. In the end, it doesn't really matter. Because Uberroth's deal fell through when the unions insisted that Frank Lorenzo had to be replaced immediately by a caretaker figure before any deal could be struck. Around this time, the name of Carl Icahn also surfaced as a possible buyer for Eastern. Carl, a great business mind, had once forged an alliance with the unions and gained control of TWA at a time when Frank Lorenzo was very interested in acquiring that airline. It would have been very interesting, to say the least, to see these two in action, but Icahn must not have liked what he found out about Eastern because the deal never got past the talking stage. The real shocker was when a relatively little-known company called American West Airlines arrived on the scene from Phoenix, Arizona. American West was intent on getting the shuttle, and it approached the bankruptcy court and the board of Eastern creditors that had been set up to handle such matters with a complex bid that was, under any of the various options they proposed, at least $100 million higher than mine. I remember getting the news, and then walking into my brother's office and saying, "Well, our deal is dead." I didn't know much about American West at that time, but as pessimistic as I was, I did some research on the company. What I found out was that it was one of the few new startup airlines that had been able to survive. And it was highly thought of on Wall Street. It had a very aggressive management and a very good reputation for passenger service. The problem was that in the 2 years prior to its bid, it had experienced some financial difficulties. Its aggressiveness had caused a certain overextension in terms of financing, and it had lost money. However, In the current year, it was doing very well, and it was in fact showing a profit. Since it seemed to be such a sharp outfit, I was truly surprised at how much higher its bid was than mine. But I figured that, given the company's reputation, it must have been its financing. Usually when a company bids on an asset, especially in a situation where its offer becomes front page news in the Wall Street Journal and many other papers, it has its money lined up in advance and is not going in with a deal that can't be consummated. Though the situation looked bad, I didn't feel defeated. Instead, I called in Harvey Freeman, a top executive of mine who had been instrumental in hammering out our agreement with Frank Lorenzo. Now, I said to Harvey, the war begins. The first thing Harvey and I did was dig deeper into my American West research. Once we did, I started to see flaws that might be exploited. The company was highly leveraged, and despite the fact that I had made a small profit that year and was obviously not heading in the right direction, its balance sheet was not at all strong. I then told Harvey, Robert, and all my top people that I wanted in the world to know about the shaky state of America West. It wouldn't be hard getting the word out. I knew. The media were all over the Eastern story. A couple days later, I found myself speaking with a writer from the Wall Street Journal, from the start had covered the entire American Airlines affair very extensively. I described to the reporter at length what I had found out about the company, then concluded by saying, in my opinion, if America West does this transaction and pays the ridiculous price that it's offering, it will quickly become the next People Express. In other words, I was saying that their offer was so excessive that it would lead to them quickly into bankruptcy. The next day, the Journal ran a story in the right-hand column on the front page, the most prestigious space in the paper, based largely on my interview. The headline read, America West's bid for Eastern Shuttle may pose big risks. Rival bidder Trump doubts its financial resources. Prior expansion backfired. The story started like this. Donald Trump can barely hide his contempt for American West Airlines, a carrier he claims he never heard of before. It topped his offer for the Eastern Shuttle with a $415 million bid. Then it concluded with a quote from me. You just have to look at their balance sheet to see this is not a company in a position to overpay for the shuttle. This is not IBM. If I were a bank, I wouldn't loan them money for anything. From there, the story went on to explain, in the writer's words, the difficulties America West was having with financing. The Wall Street Journal, right or wrong, has a lot of power. And that front page story illustrated it vividly. Consider that the judge had set a deadline for financing, and that America West was very close to getting its financing on the morning the article appeared. In less than 24 hours, America West was devastated as a result of that one journal story. Shockwaves went through all of Wall Street and their entire financial and airline communities, and America West lost its credibility. At the last moment, despite the airline's repeated announcements that it would have no trouble getting the money to back its bid, America West announced that it had to withdraw its offer for lack of financing. The judge then ruled that the shuttle was mine. The defeat of America West not only made me feel great, it made me a very popular person with certain banks. What had been perceived as a solid business transaction just a couple of weeks before now looked like one of the great deals of the decade. Suddenly, everyone was running to loan me money to buy this wonderful asset. And though I already had my financing from Citibank, I was inundated with calls from other institutions wanting to know if they could take a piece of the financing or lead it, and promising me all kinds of better deals. In retrospect, considering the market conditions that have affected the shuttle and our peers, they shouldn't have been making those offers. I just shook my head and smiled. Success, so often, is just a matter of perception. That was the same deal I had had for months. but because another company had come in, bid substantially more, and then dropped out, I suddenly seen a bigger winner than before. I was suddenly seen as a bigger winner than before. The Shuttle West deal also proved the value of being a poker player. When America West came along, everyone wanted me to raise my bid as much as $100 million to ensure that I'd get the shuttle. I knew, though, that I wasn't going to raise my bid by even 1 cent. I wanted to stand pat and take my chances. If somebody was willing to spend hundreds of millions more than I was, then I wanted to let him have what he wanted and wish him good luck. It was a tough experience. Under slightly different circumstances, the deal could have gone a lot more smoothly. But when I look back on the situation, I think of a friend of mine, a very good and talented politician who was running for office unopposed, or so he thought. At the last moment, a very strong challenger announced that he was running for the same spot. Initially, my friend was devastated. From day one to the next, he had gone from having an easy campaign to facing the prospect of much harder work, followed by possible defeat. But he didn't give up. Instead, he ran a great campaign, and it ended up beating the hell out of his opponent. I'll never forget his coming to me afterwards and telling me that the challenge was the best thing that had ever happened to him. It transformed a non-event into a major political victory. Because he had to fight his way into office, the victory was much sweeter. I know what he meant. In retrospect, I'm glad America West came along. They wound up giving me the Trump Shuttle, a tremendous boost. It should be noted that one of the people most successful. It should be noted that one of the people most helpful to the labor cause after the non-union America West arrived on the scene was New York State Governor Mario Cuomo. Through his brilliant economic development advisor, Vincent Tess, the chairman of the New York State Urban Development Corporation, Cuomo let it be known that he was tired of seeing the Eastern unions pushed around. He had little compassion for a non-union carrier like America West, which came in from Phoenix to exploit an already sad situation. By exerting his influence, Governor Cuomo did a truly great service for the union employees of the Trump Shuttle, not only in preserving jobs, but in helping them get a great moral victory. When I took over the shuttle from Eastern, it had only about 17% of the market. Today the Trump Shuttle is running beautifully, with its maintained aircrafts that look great on the ground or in air. As I write this, our market share has grown to about 50%. That sounds good, but frankly it's disappointing to me, because we've had a far better operation. Terminals, planes, service, better than Pan Am. I was a little worried when I took over the shuttle because I was aware that Eastern was known for its animosity towards passengers and its bad service. I'd assumed that this attitude was ingrained in the people who worked for Eastern. Was I ever wrong? The level of employee spirit and of service to the passengers of the new Trump Shuttle had been far higher than it would have if I'd gone out and hired all new workers. The Eastern employers had been stifled for years. When they were released, there was a tremendous burst of energy. They wanted to prove that they could do the job. They wanted to show the public and the world that everybody had been wrong about them. And boy, have they been able to show it. Perhaps the most spectacular example of the kind of people I have working on my planes is Captain Bob Smith. It was a rainy summer afternoon a few months after I bought the shuttle that I first heard of this extraordinary pilot. I was in the middle of a routine phone conversation, trying to convince McDonald's to lease a piece of land I own in Brooklyn for a hamburger stand. I was negotiating with the McDonald's representatives, telling them my site was the greatest site in the history of fast food, or whatever, when one of my executives came into my office and said that he had to speak with me immediately. I put McDonald's on the hold. I've got good news and I got bad news, this executive said. Matter of factly, the good news is that we have a master pilot on the plane. Huh? I said to him. What pilot are you talking about? That's the bad news, he said. I'm talking about the plane that's circling Logan Airport in Boston, because one wheel won't come down. The first thing I did was to turn on the TV. And there, live on CNN, was my plane coming in for a landing. The approach seemed to go on forever, but finally Captain Smith touched down that 727 down perfectly. I couldn't believe things had gone as smoothly as they looked, but a few minutes later the passengers started appearing on camera and saying that it had been a regular landing. They hadn't felt a thing. In fact, I later checked records, and virtually all of them who were making return trips to New York came back on the Trump Shuttle. I've got to go up and congratulate the pilot, I said. By that time, various members of my staff had gathered around the TV to watch the landing. They all looked at me as if I were crazy. It'll just make for a day of bad press about the Trump Shuttle. More negative stuff, one of them said, speaking for the group. Let it pass. It was a classic management problem. To go or to not go. But with all due respect to those fine people, they were making the wrong decision. I know how airlines traditionally treat these matters, I said, but there's nothing negative about this. Negative is a catastrophe. What we've got here is an excellent pilot showing their talent and grace under pressure. A hero. I immediately went up to Boston on the next shuttle flight to publicly congratulate Bob Smith and the entire crew. The media attention we received as a result of my shuttle visit was overwhelmingly positive. The next day, the Trump Shuttle numbers were substantially up. For all the progress, however, the situation with the shuttle remains complicated. Business travels in the Northeast is down overall, and costs are up more than we planned for. I even told a Wall Street Journal reporter that I would sell if I got the right price. Gradually, I've come to realize, as I have with the Plaza, that resorting a great asset is not enough to cover expenses when you're paying off a large acquisition debt. I made a tactical mistake in saying publicly that I might sell the shuttle, because people's confidence in the airline is bound to be shaken if I seem to be pulling out. The shuttle is now profitable. Frankly, I'm glad I saved it. I'm proud of the way it's been improved. It is now the best. Chapter 8. Ship of Jewels, the Trump Princess. I've always been interested in Aiden Kananowski, at first because of his success and more recently because of his spectacular troubles and the way he handled them. Khashoggi, a Saudi Arabian, is one of the world's greatest brokers. I can honestly say that I've never encountered or heard of anyone who is better at the bullshit part of the business. The parties, the schmoozing, the business of up the favors, the building up of favors that you later call in when you need to get a deal done. In a way, Khashoggi reminds me of Steve Rubel, the late co-owner of Studio 54 and other Manhattan hotspots. Both managed to use a very important social scene to their own benefit. Both men also engineered tremendous loyalty. Both men also endeared tremendous loyalty in almost all the high-powered people they came in contact with. The difference was that for Steve, a very good friend, the parties were an end in themselves. As someone said at his funeral, he knew how to make people feel good. Khashoggi, on the other hand, used to wine, women, and wild times to put together untold billions of dollars worth of deals. If only he had kept on doing what he was good at, which was creating a chemistry between people and putting them together in his role as a broker. If he had simply put his commissions into a bank in Switzerland and forgot about them, he'd be wealthy beyond belief today. But he wanted to play a bigger and more meaningful role in life, so he wound up helping Ferdinand and Elmia Marcos and was accused of ripping off the government of the Philippines for tens of millions of dollars, a charge of which he has been acquitted. He also surfaced as a key figure in the Iran affair, in the Iran-Contra affair. His world fell apart. During a visit to Bern, Switzerland, he was arrested, and he was eventually extradited to the United States. Once the friend of kings, presidents, and princes, he was reduced for a time to walking around Manhattan with a special electronic device on his ankle that alerted the police if he left the 5 boroughs of New York City. In 1987, I hadn't met him yet, and didn't know if I would find him an interesting guy personally, but I had read a lot about him during the last several years, and I found his fall from grace absolutely fascinating. That's why when Norma came in and told me that someone was calling from England in regarding the sale of Khashoggi's famous yacht, I dropped whatever I was doing and reached for the phone. I'd never been much of a boat person, and because of that, I frankly didn't know what the broker, an Englishman named Jonathan Beckett, was talking about when he mentioned words like tenders, bilges, and dinghies. I didn't even know if the price Beckett was asking for the yacht, $50 million, was realistic. Though I suspected I could get it cheaper. All I knew for sure was that I wanted that vessel. Usually when I do a deal, it fits into some larger plan. I buy a hotel on the boardwalk in Atlantic City because I need the rooms for my casino customers. Or I invest in a department store chain like Alexander's because the company owns some very desirable real estate. But my purchase of that yacht was something else entirely. It was a deal done strictly for the sake of dealing. Art for art's sake, in a way. It reminded me of when I bought Mar-a-Lago, my house in Palm Beach. I didn't need a 118-room house in Florida. I didn't need this 282-foot boat either. I just saw an opportunity to acquire something at a fantastic price, and I seized the moment. The yacht had been an important tool of Khashoggi's trade. I knew that much as I listened to Jonathan Beckett's sale pitch on the phone that day. With its huge kitchens and wine cellar, and its fuel tanks big enough to take it around the world without stopping, the Nebula, as it was then known, was the ultimate party boat. It came complete, Jonathan said, with a private deck for sunbathing, massage, and steam rooms, and a mind-boggling master bedroom, and a ceiling with a bed big enough for 6 people. The bathroom, just off the master's quarters, had a shower stall carved out of solid onyx. One room was also full of pinball machines and video games. There was also a disco that had a state-of-the-art laser lighting system, a machine that sent smoke swirling around the dance floor, and a penciled ceiling in which pictures of Khashoggi, his guests, and his family flashed on and off in time to the music. "It's the ultimate in opulence," John Beckett said. I agreed that it sounded incredible, but in my opinion, the Khashoggi touches were more than a little too much. After all, there were secret doors allowing guests to slip in and out of one another's rooms discreetly, and 2-way mirrors for voyeurs. I have since learned that Khashoggi, at the height of his success, rented an entire floor of a hotel in Monte Carlo, where the beautiful women who came to his parties would stay. I have no interest in making moral judgment about people, so I can't say I was shocked to learn about the wild parties that took place on board the Nebula, which Khashoggi had named, by the way, for his daughter. I don't think anything could shock me any more. Not that wild behavior is all that common among the rich and famous. Most successful people I know are, on the contrary, so wrapped up in their work that they never let their hair down. Unless you like to talk about real estate deals or the stock market, you'll probably find their company boring. I don't include Khashoggi in that group. Although I wasn't particularly happy to see Khashoggi being forced to sell his magnificent yacht, I can honestly say I didn't mind being the beneficiary. Jonathan Beckett has since told me that negotiations for a large yacht sometimes take 2 or 3 years to complete. The deal for Khashoggi's boat, however, went swiftly and relatively smoothly. There's no reason why it shouldn't. I was an interested buyer, and the seller was even more eager than I was. Khashoggi's life was such a mess at that point that he no longer owned the Nebula. It had passed into the hands of the Sultan of Brunei, who took it in a settlement of a $50 million loan. From my point of view, that made little difference. Either way, I was still dealing with someone who wanted to unload the yacht as quickly as possible. About 20 minutes into the first phone conversation I ever had about the yacht, I offered to buy it for $15 million. Beckett, who had called me cold to discuss the opportunity, must have been shocked. In the first place, he knew that I had seen the boat only once, when I happened to be in Monte Carlo and caught a glimpse of it at the pier. I can, and often do, make major decisions right on the spot, and sometimes blow people away. One of my greatest advantages is that I am an individual, not a corporation, and I don't have to go back to headquarters and deal with a bureaucracy. Another reason Beckett probably couldn't believe what he was hearing was that it was such a low-ball offer, considering that the yacht had probably cost $85 million to build in the early 80s, and that to construct an identical boat would probably cost between $150 million and $200 million at the time. I knew that my price was unrealistic and that I'd have to pay more if I really wanted the boat, but I wanted to see right away if the Nebula was going to be the bargain that I thought it might be. If Beckett rejected my offer and the conversation stopped right there, I'd know I probably wasn't going to get a great price. And that would probably be the beginning and the end of my fascination with boating. Jonathan's response, though, was that he could arrange to fly in from London so that we could talk further. I took that as a sign that my ridiculously low offer might not be so ridiculous after all. Sometimes the most glamorous and highly publicized deals are no more complicated, basically, than what happens every day on any used car lot. Certainly this negotiation was anything but complex. When Beckett walked into my office a few days later, he was asking $32 million for the vessel. I countered with $28 million, figuring we could settle eventually on $30 million, which we did after about 30 minutes of conversation. The next day, after the story popped up in the newspaper, dozens of people called Jonathan Beckett's firm, Nigel Burgress, offering to beat my offer by several $1,000,000. I had warned John that was going to happen, and so neither of us were surprised when people who hadn't been heard from before were suddenly trying to top my bid. I didn't think John even took their phone calls. There was, however, one unexplored development after we came to an agreement on price. I got a call from a representative of the Sultan of Brunei, who said that Khashoggi was worried that his daughter's name would be used on the boat. Of course, I had no intention of continuing to call the yacht the Nebula, but my first reaction was not to give away anything without getting something in return. I'll think about it, I said, and I did, until the intermediary called back a few days later to say that the Sultan, out of respect for Khashoggi, was prepared to knock $1 million off the purchase price if I agreed to change the name of the boat. I said that would be fine, and the final purchase price became $29 million. Now I faced the question of what I was going to do with the boat. As much as I loved it as a work of art, I knew that it would never become part of my personal lifestyle. I might enjoy cruising around the world as I wandered through the yacht's 5 decks and 100-odd rooms. Who knows? Realistically speaking, I knew I'd never try doing that. It made me nervous to relax. Instead, I saw a great opportunity to use the Trump Princess for business purposes. I could give parties in New York for visiting dignitaries, and I could invite the media on board whenever I had a big new project to announce. But where the yacht would fit best, I sensed, was in Atlantic City. Not only was I building a magnificent new marina at Trump Castle, but the yacht seemed made to order for a town where the high rollers gravitate towards opulence and luxury. The plan I envisioned was to make the Trump Princess a kind of floating suite for high rollers. Only the most important customers of the Trump Castle, the Trump Plaza, and eventually the Taj Mahal would be granted the privilege of staying on board and having my full crew at their disposal at absolutely no cost. This, I knew, played right into the psychology of the high roller. These are a very diverse bunch of people, and they all live life to the hilt. They expect the best, and they do not suffer fools or foolish situations. Gladly, the Trump Princess, I knew, would be made to order for people who can't be pampered enough. Before I got too far along with my plans, though, I had to close on the yacht, something that proved far more difficult than negotiating the basic deal. One problem was that there were various components of the boat scattered throughout the Mediterranean. One of the tenders, a launch I had just learned, which takes passengers back and forth between the boat and the dock, was in the Antibes. Two others were in Monte Carlo. The yacht itself, meanwhile, was in San Remo, Italy. There was no way that I could take time away from my other businesses to fly over there and scat around and inspect everything. So, as eager as I was to finally step aboard the Trump Princess, I asked Jeff Walker if he could take care of the closing. Jeff, a friend since we both attended New York Military Academy, is a vice president in charge of special projects for the Trump organization. I call Jeff the Eye because he has great aesthetic sense, and also because, like me, he isn't dazzled by beauty. When he looks at something that everyone else is bowled over by, he homes in on the same small imperfections that I myself never fail to see. Besides that, Jeff grew up around the docks, and he knows boats. Unfortunately, having Jeff representing me didn't mean I'd have a quick closing. Every day, all the lawyers and advisors for both sides would get on the yacht and motor off to a point at least 12 miles from the Italian coast, so the deal could be consummated in international waters, and nobody would have to pay taxes. And every morning the Trump Princess would come back to San Remo without anyone having signed the sales agreement. It wasn't that either side was being inflexible. The problem was that there was a huge inventory list to go over, and we had to make sure all the silver, handmade linens, and valuable crystal that I had negotiated to have included in the purchase price was in fact on board. After days of sailing around and checking, it turned out that very little was missing. Khashoggi had left behind many extremely valuable items made of gold, silver, and porcelain. Oddly enough, several pinball machines that could have been worth more than a few $100s were missing. Once we'd finally closed on the deal, I flew to Italy to see the boat at last. Walking through the Trump Princess for the first time, I was thrilled and honestly surprised. I had expected something fabulous, but this was even better than I had imagined. It was obvious that Khashoggi had spared no expense. He had obtained the finest leathers, suedes, and other fabrics. The workmanship on the curved door to each stateroom was absolutely stunning. The woodwork throughout the boat, in fact, was like nothing I'd ever seen. If you opened a closet and pulled out a drawer, you found that the inside of the drawer had the same beautifully lacquered finish as the outside of the closet. And there were high-tech touches everywhere. A button on the nightstand next to the master bed automatically opened a drawer that contained more buttons for turning on the television and air conditioning and lowering the movie screen. At the same time, there were signs that the yacht had been used hard. For example, there were dozens of little indentations in the ceiling where champagne corks had bounced off of it and left their mark. And there were stains on the carpet and worn spots on some sofas. Those things might not have bothered most people, but they set off the alarm for me. "I want this boat to look perfect," I said to Jeff Walker, who accompanied me as I strolled the decks. "Anything that's worn, I want replaced. Anything that's soiled, I want deep cleaned." I also told him that I was willing to spend $3.5 million to make the yacht look brand new again. I gave the job of refurbishing the yacht to a Dutch group called Amels. I didn't talk a lot to people about the job. I didn't have the time. It was already December of 1987, and I wanted the work done quickly so that the yacht could spend the summer of 1988 in Atlantic City and New York. Amels is a small outfit situated in the town of Macum in the Friesland area of the Netherlands. I'd asked around, and they had a great reputation for doing what they had promised, bringing projects in on time. I also found out firsthand that they took great pride in their work. The Trump Princess is so big that getting it into the Amels yacht yard on Lake Ezegel proved to be something of a problem. The water in the canal leading to the Amels repair shed, as it's called, had to be kept extremely high, so high that it threatened to flood some nearby farmland. We needed special permission from the Dutch government to keep the water at the necessary level, but that didn't prove to be a problem, since the job that we were bringing in was so beneficial to the local economy. Fortunately, there was never any serious flooding, despite the yacht's huge size. There were, however, more than a few tense moments, since the canal was narrow, and we only had about 3 feet of clearance on either side. Once they got the yacht into the shed, the ML's people moved in immediately and began to tear the whole thing apart. Their first task was to work hard on the hull, which was not as finely finished as it could have been. I pride myself in being a quick study, and I noticed on my inspection tour that the hull was obviously waffled, a result I learned after asking around a bit of the fact that the Nebula was built in a shipyard instead of a yacht yard, where there are higher standards of exterior workmanship. When I pointed that out to the ML's people, they assured me that after they had stripped the hull down to bare steel and filled in the indentations with a special putty-like substance, the yacht, even up close, would have the absolutely perfect lines it deserved. Another change I ordered after talking to the captain and the crew was a conversion from a single rudder steering system, which made the boat very hard to handle, to a double rudder system. Now Captain Richard Cuxon tells me the big yacht turns like a speedboat. I don't think I've ever seen people work harder than the ML's team. They tore the engines apart and rebuilt them, put in a new communication system and a new radar system, and updated all the electronics. They also had to drill a huge hole in one side of the boat to install an additional bow thruster, a propeller that would make it easier to maneuver the boat sideways, toward, or away from the dock. We needed a second bow thruster because the tides are so much stronger in New York Harbor and Atlantic City than they are in the Mediterranean. I was learning a lot, but there are times, for instance, when the fabric samples were flying back and forth across the Atlantic, when my experience in designing hotels and apartment buildings came into play. On one such occurrence, the interior designers in Holland were faced with the problems of repairing water damage to a truly magnificent ceiling in one of the staterooms. The ceiling, a true work of art, was covered in a basket weave pattern of light brown leather and suede. When I heard about the situation, I asked a few questions and determined that virtually all of the water spots were around the edges of the ceiling. I then suggested replacing those areas with tiles. But don't try to match the color, I said, because you'll never do that exactly, and it will always look like a past job. Instead, I suggested getting tiles made up of a contrasting color, such as a deep chocolate brown. They did, and now the ceiling tiles look as good as new, as if it had always had a rich, dark border. When the yacht was almost finished, Jeff Walker, who had been commuting from New York for months to oversee the job, suggested that I fly over and take a look, just to make sure that there wouldn't be any unpleasant surprises. I took Ivana and her assistant, as well as my executive assistant, Norma. We flew over in my plane to Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam. Then we took a helicopter to the town of Macomb, where we landed right in the grounds of the ML's yacht yard. Quite a few townspeople turned out to welcome us, and there was an American flag flying on top of one of the buildings. And all the workers were proud of their accomplishment. They deserved to be. They'd done a magnificent job. I'd only seen 2 criticisms. One had to do with the 250 telephones on board. I didn't like them. I'm not talking about the system itself, but about the instrument you hold in your hand. The ML's people had chosen a contemporary European-style receiver, and those things didn't feel substantial enough, in my opinion. The other thing I had a problem with was the fabric on some of the sofas. Instead of getting a new material, Jeff Walker had tried to clean what was there. And there were still some small, very subtle spots that probably only I could see, but they bothered me. "This just won't do, Jeff," I said. He agreed and immediately made arrangements to have the sofas removed and recovered. The Princess arrived in Greenwich, Connecticut on Saturday afternoon, the 2nd of July. It looked absolutely magnificent, sitting out there in Long Island. Sound with all the local boats buzzing around it like bees around a hive. Even the most experienced sailors had never seen anything like it before. 2 days later, the Princess cruised into New York Harbor for the Independence Day celebration. On board, a beautiful dinner party was in progress. The guest list was star-studded. The next day, we took the Princess to Atlantic City, where it would begin its career as a tourist attraction and a bonus that would be granted to my best customers. It's important to generalize about high rollers. Some are loud and brash guys in flashy clothes. Others are quiet, almost professional types. Professional types. Some can win or lose tens of thousands of dollars on the throw of a dice and just walk away. Others I've seen react to a loss by taking off their Rolexes, throwing them on the floor, and stomping on them. But not one of them failed to be impressed by the Trump Princess. Of course, in other places than Atlantic City, the Trump Princess also symbolized wealth and success. On at least one occasion, that proved to be a problem. Super Bowl Sunday of 1989 was a wild time. I was on the boat in Biscayne Bay, just outside the riot-torn Miami, and we were having a big pregame brunch with Don Johnson and Melanie Griffith, Liza Minnelli, and other celebrities. As game time approached and we were heading in to the shore, I asked the captain, "What are all those fires over there? And where exactly are we docking?" The captain, who was English, just said, "Oh, you can't see precisely where we're docking because of the fire and the smoke." "Wait a minute," I said. 2 days ago they had a riot here that burned down half of Miami. If we dock this boat where people are protesting, you'll end up causing riots like you've never seen. Common sense dictates that you don't dock a $100 million yacht in an area where people are out of control. We sail on to another safer section of the city. The incredible thing about the yacht was that no one could look at it and not have a strong reaction. The press went absolutely wild when I first brought it to New York. I had thought that it might get into a few lines in Liz Smith's column and other places. Instead, Newsweek ran a huge article. New York Magazine did a cover story about the boat, and several other publications also provided great coverage. After a couple of years, I started to think about an even bigger boat, and I actually had plans drawn out for one. This is a classic example of how I keep trying to top myself. Owning the world's most magnificent yacht only made me want to get something even bigger and better. But as much as I enjoyed it up until now, and as impressive as it's been to my casino customers, I think I'm giving up the game of who's got the best boat. The Trump Princess is is up for sale. I don't need it anymore. I don't want it anymore. And frankly, I can find better things to do with the money. It's funny how the boat seemed more appropriate to my life in the past than to my future. The next chapter is called Chapter 9, Battling on the Boardwalk, Life in Atlantic City.